All right, well, thank you very much for coming, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our first panel session today, in which we explore whether free trade is an idea in decline. And we're very grateful to have three distinguished panelists here today, Professor David Dorn, State Secretary Marie-Gabrielle Ineichen-Fleisch, and Professor Kevin O'Rourke. So David Dorn is Professor of International Trade and Labor Markets here at the University of Zurich. He's made quite a splash with a recent paper discussing or analyzing the effects of Chinese import competition on US labor markets, which has changed the way we think about trade, not just within academia, but also outside of academia. So thank you very much, David, for being on the panel today. And then State Secretary Marie-Gabrielle Ineichen-Fleisch is the current director of the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, which is also known as SECO, and also the director of the Swiss Foreign Economic Affairs Directorate. So before that, she also held many high-ranking positions in the Swiss administration, including being the chief negotiator of Switzerland at the World Trade Organization. So also thank you very much for coming. And then Kevin O'Rourke is a professor of economic history and international trade at the University of Oxford, and also the research director of the Center for Economic Policy Research in London, CEPR. He's one of the world's leading academics working at the intersection of economic history and international trade, and has published widely on the history of globalization and deglobalization. So also thank you for being with us today. So before handing over to David, let me just briefly explain how this panel is going to be organized. So first, our speakers are going to make their opening statements for 10, 15 minutes. Maybe, we have a few questions up here among us directly after that. But then, quite quickly, I also want to open this up to the floor and invite everyone to ask questions. So without further ado, I would say, David, the floor is yours.
Yeah. That's me.
Yeah,
that's not you.
So we have the wrong presentation.
Well, let me start even without my slides. Well, I was starting by remarking that the division of labor, specialization, and subsequent exchange of goods is really one of the fundamental bases of the creation of wealth in society. And that holds at the level of individual people, where we've moved away from an economy in which everyone is a subsistence farmer and produces for own consumption, to a system of specialized occupations that subsequently trade the outputs of their specialized productions. And that principle of specialization and the exchange of goods is also in play when we look at aggregate countries. And this country, Switzerland, is a strong example, because Switzerland is not producing many of the goods that we regularly consume, including many raw materials, and at the flip side, it is exporting a lot of the goods it manufactures, be it pharmaceuticals or machines, precision instruments, luxury goods, or even coffee capsules. All of those goods could not be produced in such large quantities and with the associated large employment if Switzerland had not the ability to sell those goods globally. It is thus quite evident to the scholar of economics that trade in principle is a good thing. And indeed, the undergraduate students who reads Greg Mankew's famous textbook on the 10 principles of economics learns as the principle number 5 that trade can make everyone better off. The statement, however, already hints that trade does not necessarily always make everyone better off. And in another textbook, Krugman and Obstfeld explain that situation where trade could create losers. They say that the owners of a country's abundant factors gain from trade, but owners of a country's scarce factors lose. Compared with the rest of the world, the United States or also Switzerland is abundantly endowed with highly skilled labor, and low-skilled labor is correspondingly scarce. This means that international trade tends to make low-skilled workers in the United States worse off, and that not just temporarily, but on a sustained basis. If we put that argument into a graph, then the situation that these authors are referring to is one where we have to make a choice between a situation with less trade, in which aggregate income is smaller but more evenly distributed, or a situation with more trade that generates more income overall, but possibly a decline in income for the less skilled. Nevertheless, economists have for a long time not been very worried about this situation, and that had two reasons. The first is that economists like to pull out the magic wand of economic theory and point out the second theorem of welfare economics, which says if the government has some technology available to costlessly tax and redistribute income, then we could always benefit from that situation where aggregate income is largest, because we can subsequently redistribute the income in any which way we want. That has some real-world problems because we don't have that distortion-free taxation system. So instead, economists actually pointed out another empirical feature, which was that until the 1990s and way into the 2000s, a lot of academic research showed that the impacts of international trade on labor markets and inequality were actually very modest. But as the profession coincided on that view that trade really does not have much of an impact on labor markets, the underlying patterns of trade themselves underwent a monumental change. And that change came not only in an expansion of world trade over the past couple of decades, but it also came in the form of a changing composition in international trade. Until the 1980s, almost all world exports came out of high-income countries. Trade occurred mostly by exchanging goods between similar countries, like Germany trading with France or the United States trading with Canada. It is a much more recent phenomenon that we see a rapidly rising share of exports coming out of low-income and low-wage countries, and there is actually a single country that accounts for the majority of that shift, and that is China. China, as we heard already in the first lecture this morning, started to institute market-oriented reforms during the 1980s. In the 1990s, these took up speed and led to a rapid opening of that country to international trade. And as a consequence, China moved from being almost a non-entity in world trade as little as 25 years ago to being the world's largest exporter of manufactured goods. While that was happening, other countries in the West that receive a lot of Chinese imports, such as the United States, experienced a decline in their manufacturing employment, which in the US, for instance, dropped from about 18 million jobs around the year 2000 to 12 million by the end of that decade. It is tempting to think that the coincidence of these phenomena, Western countries importing more and seeing their own manufacturing employment decline, could embody a causal relationship. Drawing that inference just from aggregate time series data is difficult, but in work with my long-term co-authors, Gordon Hansen and David Otter, we studied how these competition by Chinese imports affects different regions across the United States. The idea here is that the darker shaded parts on this map are more specialized in industries that subsequently face larger competition by China. An example would be Raleigh in North Carolina, a city that has a strong manufacturing base in textile manufacturing, in the production of furniture, in the production of electronics and computers, all of which face heavy Chinese import competition. And that contrasts with other places like Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania that has an equally large manufacturing base but is more specialized in heavy manufacturing and chemicals that is facing less competitive pressure from Chinese imports. When we compare cities like these over time, then we see that the more import-competing cities have experienced differentially large declines in their manufacturing employment. That holds both among more and among less skilled workers. There is also some spillovers into other sectors of these economies, especially transportation, construction or mining, who also tend to employ lower skilled workers in those locations, have contracted. While we see that net decline in employment, we do not observe a strong geographic migration response. Many of these workers remain in those depressed manufacturing areas and become unemployed or leave the labor force altogether. A more recent follow-up research by us and others has indicated a wider range of social consequences in these locations, including greater rates of property crime, a greater incidence of drug and alcohol mortality, which is a big epidemic currently in the United States. There are falling marriage rates, a greater risk that kids grow up in households without two parents and in households below the poverty line. And we also see that those places have become more likely to elect politicians to US Congress who come either from far left in the political spectrum or more likely from the far right. And those places also have shown greater electoral support for Donald Trump. While we see evidence for these concentrated losses in some US locations, the experience in some European countries has been notably different. And part of what separates countries is that their overall trade portfolio is quite different from the United States. The US and also the United Kingdom are countries that largely just import from China but have very little exporting activity there. And those are also both countries where manufacturing employment has declined especially strongly. Other countries like Germany or Switzerland have an almost balanced trade relationship with the Chinese, and those countries have been much more successful in using the opening of the East to find new markets for their own goods. As a consequence, when colleagues in Germany replicated that analysis of local labor markets for Germany, what they found is that German regions that are specialized in import-competing industries have seen employment declines that are quantitatively quite similar to those seen in some American cities. But at the same time, Germany is much more abundant in cities that actually benefited from export booms, which created so many jobs that the net job effect for Germany may actually be a positive one. When we now look at survey data on popular opinion facing trade, then that survey data does, to a remarkable extent, reflect some of these patterns. In a big international survey in the year 2011, residents of many countries here ordered by per capita income were asked whether trade is good or at least somewhat good for their country. In most countries, actually all of the countries shown here, a majority of people says that trade is generally good. The agreement with that statement varies, however. You see to the right of the graph, 70% in the US versus 90% in Germany, agreeing with that statement. When it comes to the more specific question, whether trade is not just good overall, but whether trade has actually created jobs in a country, then we see quite strong differences. Here the question is asked in a negative direction, so whether trade has destroyed jobs. And you can see in poorer countries, people don't really think that. In richer countries, agreement with that statement is quite high, reaching 50% in the US or about 25% in Germany. So when we try to take a summary of these findings, then it is important to stress that even if there is evidence on negative consequences of trading, which are quite concentrated in certain locations and for certain demographics, then that does not fundamentally question the notion that free trade is good overall. However, the work that I've done with my colleagues unambiguously shows that trade creates losers as well as winners, and we believe that creating a political environment that remains conducive to free trade will require acknowledging and addressing these adverse consequences. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this distinguished panel. After the previous speakers, I would refrain from making general comments on the phenomenon of globalization. I am not really the right person to do so, but I would like to focus on Switzerland. And I would like to focus on three questions regarding Switzerland. The first one is, what role actually does globalization play for Switzerland, and how has Switzerland dealt with the structural changes in the last years? The second one is, how is Switzerland affected by the developments that we have seen, like the new trade policy in the US or the decision on Brexit? Finally, I would like to deal with the issue, how do we ensure or can we ensure that we continue to reap the benefits of this development, but we also take into account what we have heard this morning are losers or people that are perceive themselves as being losers. So starting with the first one, what role does globalization play in Switzerland? I think it is quite clear to everybody we are a small, open economy, heavily dependent on trade. And just let me give you a few figures on that. More than 40% of total demand comes from outside of Switzerland. The export is, we export about 63% of our total GDP or GNP, which is nearly 2 out of 3 francs that we earn outside our country. Then if you look at the sum of exports and imports for goods and services at the development in the last 20 years, this share has risen from 69% to 94%. And finally, if we look at foreign direct investment, we have foreign direct investment of about 1,120 billion, which is providing for about 2 million jobs outside of Switzerland. In the contrary, we have about 800 billion FDI in Switzerland, providing for about 500,000 jobs. So you see a very heavily integrated economy in the world. Now, globalization has changed somewhat the trade pattern also for Switzerland. With those global value chains becoming more and more important, it was important that companies in Switzerland can integrate into these into these global value chains and actually produce value-added products. So in order to do this, we are dependent on open markets. We are dependent to be able to import, but we are, of course, also be able to export and compete successfully on foreign markets. This has also the effect of ensuring that internally in Switzerland we we ensure competitiveness, and this in turn fosters innovation. Now, also in Switzerland we have critical voices saying that, this globalization creates losers, or maybe, as I was saying before, that people think that they may become losers at a certain point. Maybe they're not today, but they may become in the future. And I think that these adjustment policies Professor Balcerowicz was talking about, they have been quite successfully implemented in Switzerland for a long time. And I would like to show this also by saying that structural change in Switzerland has been quite smooth. If we look at the last 20 years, 860,000 jobs have been actually created. Of course, in other sectors than we had 20 years ago. But we have jobs and we have this very low unemployment share. So what are the reasons? I think there are several. I would just like to point 3 of these. And I think everything starts with education. Education has been mentioned also before. We have an education system that ensures that the young people actually learn jobs or are prepared for jobs that are asked by the market. And this is thanks to or due to our dual vocal education system, which was under heavy critic still 10 years ago, but after the financial crisis, I can assure you, everybody thinks they would like to introduce the same system as we have, which of course everybody's free to do, but it's not so easy to do just from one day to the other. So this is really a very important and very powerful tool. Next to this education comes continuous education, and continuous education is something we are still trying to improve. Whether you're 30, 40, 50, or even 60, this will be the key to future success. Second thing is labor market, flexibility of labor markets. And I think there we have shown that we could keep these labor markets flexible. There are always attacks against the flexibility of this labor market, but thanks social partnership that we have and that is still functioning well, we can ensure that this flexibility is still there. And finally, if really somebody is not capable of either adapting to new job requirements or doesn't find a job after all, we have a very well established social security system which ensures that in the end nobody falls somewhere between the different nets. So all in all, I think we are well equipped, which does not mean that we just have to wait and don't do anything, but we have to continue to make sure that we can keep these advantages and these adjustment policies as we have them. Now I come to the second point: how is Switzerland affected by things like US trade policy and Brexit? As both are explained, at least in part, by anti-globalization reactions or protectionist reactions. By the way, I am often asked, has protectionism actually risen in the last few years? And if you look at studies, it's very unclear whether it has. But if you take the FMI, then the FMI says that 75% of the slowing of trade is not due to protectionist measures, but to less investment. So if you would have more investment, you would also see more trade. However, it's still extremely important for us to fight protectionist measures, to fight all these trade measures that are implemented, but that have been implemented since we have seen the other side of the issue, maybe the opening up. Now, does US trade policy affect Switzerland? I am often asked whether what happens in the US actually has a direct effect. I think it's still unclear, because except having decided not to ratify TPP and to taking many more safeguard measures, but in areas that are not directly touching on Switzerland, like in the steel area, I think it is very difficult already to see what the trade policy of the US would be. One thing I must say makes me a little bit worried and concerned, and is the fact that the United States doesn't seem to care anymore so much about the multilateral trading system. They want bilateral agreements, bilateral trade relations are important, and the basis of all our relationship in Switzerland and of many other countries is the WTO, is the multilateral trading system, which has been championed by the US for many, many years. It is there thanks to the US. Which in the 40s created the GATT. So this fact that there is this view that maybe multilateralism is not in favor of the United States, this is difficult for a country like Switzerland, very much dependent on a rules-based and not a power-based system. And you see this, for instance, lately from the fact that there is a very important dispute settlement system in WTO, and the United States does not agree to fill the vacancies in the appellate body, which means that at some point the appellate body will not be able anymore to take judgments, which is a kind of first erosion of the system. Also, the preparations for the next ministerial seems to be difficult, so this is something which I ask myself. Hopefully, the United States will change and see that it's also in their benefit to keep multilateralism. As I said, bilateral trade agreements are important. We will see what NAFTA what the results of the NAFTA negotiations will be. We have also seen the heavy emphasis on bilateral trade deficit. You know that Switzerland has also been looked at. We don't think that we are a problem because we have quite a large surplus, but it is because of pharmaceutical exports, exports of precision instruments, exports of watches, and this is not where the United States or where the administration sees the problems. So the next months or years will show. It is still very difficult to say what the future will bring. Now, how does Brexit affect Switzerland? Well, first of all, the UK is a very large trading partner for us. It is the 6th most important trading partner and the 5th most important destination for goods. Huge FDI on both sides, 150 passenger flights a day between the UK and Switzerland. And so the aim, of course, for us is what we call mind the gap or avoid the cliff edge. That is, keep things as they are, even improve them if you can. And this is the mandate we have received from the Federal Council. Now, this is quite a challenge. We have good, very informal discussions with our British colleagues, because as you know, until they have not exited the EU, they're not supposed to negotiate. So we don't negotiate, but we have very informal, interesting discussions about what happens if. And we have many ifs. Now, the one thing that makes me also there a little bit concerned is that whatever we will do or whatever we will be able to do will depend on what the UK does with the EU. Now, as long as they keep a level which is similar to the level they have today, then we might be able to avoid the cliff edge or to mind the gap. But if after the transition period, which is now foreseen, there will be a pure free trade agreement, or maybe even a bit better free trade agreement, but without harmonization with the EU, then we will face a problem, because we cannot be harmonized with 2 different partners at the same time. So there we will see also there what happens, how the relationship will look at. And as you have certainly followed, it is even the first step is not so easy, namely the leaving, but you can imagine how difficult it is afterwards to negotiate the future relationship. So how can we ensure that we can reap the benefits of globalization? We have 3 prongs which we follow, which is, first of all, you will not, and it's not because I've been a long-time negotiator at the WTO, but I am convinced WTO is the general basis for everything we do on trade, even the relationship with the EU. With all these agreements we have, 120, the basis is the WTO. So it is really an important matter that this organization keeps its credibility. Of course, it has to find new ways of developing. We have seen that rounds, as we have known them, as the Uruguay round, the last one, are not really will not prove to be successful in the future. So we will have to invent other means to be able to ensure that WTO remains an important and credible basis. What do we do? Many free trade agreements. Many free trade agreements. We have about 28 agreements with 38 countries, apart from the ones with the EU and EFTA. And if we look at the trade that is covered by all these agreements, including the ones with the EU, it's more than 80%. The ones missing is actually the United States, which is about 10% of our trade, and then several other countries like the Mercosur countries, so Brazil, Argentina, and these countries. And of course, Russia. Russia we were negotiating, but we have decided to suspend because of political reasons. Now, these negotiations are not easy. Not easy because we, of course, request a lot of opening and industrial, but we are very or quite reluctant to open up our agriculture, which for many countries is the main interest. Now, with the decisions of the Federal Council of 10 days ago, I hope this will change. I hope we will be able to do a little bit more in terms of agriculture opening, but this will remain quite a challenge. Then we have all the issues of intellectual property, of sustainability, so these negotiations have become more and more difficult. Finally, before concluding, a word about the EU. I don't want to get too much into this because that would by itself fill a whole intervention, but I would not do justice to the very important relationship we have with the EU if I didn't mention it. It is our most important trading partner. It will remain our most important trading partner. Even if we do free trade agreements with the rest of the world, the EU will remain absolutely core. So we have to ensure that we can continue to ensure that this bilateral relation continue to develop. We have seen some normalization, as we call it lately. You know that after the mass immigration initiative was accepted, we had quite difficult few years with the EU. But thanks to the very thoughtful implementation by our parliament and now also by the Federal Council in December, I think we have been able to show that we can implement this initiative and be compatible with the free movement of persons at the same time. So I would like to conclude, and as Professor Balcerowicz said, the most interesting part is always a discussion, so I look very much forward to getting many questions to be able to discuss this. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. As Ralph said, I'm a historian of globalization, which also means that I'm a historian of deglobalization. So in answer to a question that was asked in the first session, is globalization reversible? Yes, of course it is, because it's been reversed on several occasions in the past. I want to make a few preliminary points and then go on and talk about some bits of history that are maybe particularly relevant for us today. First of all, I think I agree with what was said earlier by other speakers. I think it's too early to speak of deglobalization as having already happened. Simon Evanet and his colleagues in St. Gallen have done a wonderful job documenting various non-tariff barriers that have emerged since 2008, but this is not at all comparable with the deglobalization that we saw in the interwar period. This is what deglobalization really looks like. These are average price gaps between agricultural commodities in different markets, indexed to 100 in 1913. So you can see that markets disintegrated as measured by rising price gaps across World War I. There was a reintegration, very gradual, during the 1920s, and then everything goes to hell. And everything goes to hell because tariff barriers are rising, quotas are imposed all over the place, exchange controls are imposed all over the place, and so on. And we haven't seen anything like this yet. Now, Brexit, I think, is going to be different. If the Brits get the hard Brexit that they say they want a hard Brexit, they want to leave the customs union, they want to leave the single market, then of course there will be disintegration. And if they fall over the cliff edge, which is entirely likely, then we'll get even more disintegration. And as an educator, I would say perhaps that this will be very educational if they jump over the cliff edge. The only problem is that at the bottom of the cliff is my own country, Ireland, and we risk getting squashed. And the economic consequences of that are the least of our worries. They would be catastrophic, actually, but I mean, actually the real consequences for us of that have to do with national security, and they're existential, and the government has red lines, and it can't afford to compromise on those red lines. We cannot have a border returning in Ireland. Second point, this question about that you often hear about whether anti-globalization forces today, or populism, whether these have economic or cultural causes. That question itself has become extraordinarily ideological. It's very difficult for some people on the left, especially in America, to acknowledge that some of those Trump voters might have been voting their pocketbook, might have had economic grievances, because I think in some sense, if you admit that, you're justifying the vote, and that, I understand, can be difficult to to admit if you're on the left in America faced with this abomination that is Trump. Simultaneously, if you ask people who are in favor of Brexit, they often will say it's terrible, we care about these poor workers and so on. They'll find it very difficult to admit that xenophobia and chauvinism was also an important component part of that vote. The only sensible answer to the question whether it's cultural or economic is that it's both. I think that's pretty obvious. Myself and Danny, with respective co-authors about 20 years ago, looked at attitudes towards globalization in rich and poor countries, and we found, both of us, that in rich countries, but not in poor countries, unskilled workers were much more protectionist than skilled workers, which is consistent with economic self-interest mattering for the reasons that David was talking about. But we also found that other things mattered. So here's a bunch of questions that these people were asked. Do you think that Switzerland is the best country in the world? Do you think that people who aren't Swiss are a little bit dodgy? And if you correlate these responses to these questions with attitudes towards globalization, of course you find that the more likely you are to answer yes to these questions, the more hostile to trade you are. Now, back then, in the early noughties, when I presented these sorts of findings, economists would say to me, yes, but the nationalism must be endogenous to the economic interests. If people hate foreigners, it must be because they're being hurt by the foreigners. Today, people are often arguing that the perception that people are voting their pocketbook is actually a mirage and that it's only xenophobia that is at work here, and I think it's sensible to conclude that both could be at work simultaneously. A final point just aimed at my fellow economists here. As social scientists, we're trained to look for structural explanations for things like Brexit and Trump. Deep structural interest, deep structural explanations, be they economic or non-economic. But my historian part of me does want to emphasize that there's always a role for chance and contingency in explaining these phenomena. And, well, as a Catholic, I suppose I believe in free will. And I don't think we should let our politicians off the hook either, because they always have free will. They always can make choices, and those choices matter for better or for worse. Now, there are two phases of deglobalization that I think are particularly relevant to today. The first is the late 19th century, which saw a very dramatic globalization that was ultimately technological in origin. The solid line there is an index of transport costs, freight rates, shipping rates, the cost of transporting stuff into Britain. But shipping rates were falling everywhere because of the steamship, and railroads were linking the interiors of new continents to the ports. So that's the technological shock that sets everything going. It's the equivalent of China opening up to markets today. And when that happens, you see a very dramatic increase in shipments of things like grain across the Atlantic. That's the dotted line. And you also see a collapse in the price gap between expensive wheat in England and cheap wheat on the prairies. That price gap falls. And so in Europe, you have cheap imports of wheat. And guess what? Farmers lose. And farmers see their incomes decline. And guess what? Where they have the power to do something about it, they do something about it. And they lobby their governments, and they get agricultural protection. And very often this becomes protection for manufacturing as well. So in France, in Germany, in Sweden, in Italy, you get a systematic move away from free trade, starting sometime in the late 1870s, going through the 1890s. So this is a very clear case of globalization undermining itself because it created winners and losers, and the losers have political voice, and they exercise that voice. On the other side of the Atlantic, you have something similar happening, also regarding trade, but also regarding immigration. And what you see in America and Argentina and Brazil and so on is, again, you get a gradual tightening of immigration restrictions. And that can be correlated and is correlated with rising wage inequality in those societies. And so I would argue that there is something economic going on there. But equally clearly, if you look at the obsessive focus on Asian immigration, there was clearly more than just economic interests at play. There was also racism at work there as well. Now, what's to be done about this kind of anti-globalization backlash driven by continents with very different factor endowments, very cheap land and very expensive land, or very cheap unskilled labor and very expensive unskilled labor as we have today? What's to be done about this source of anti-globalization backlash? And history can provide us with answers. Very strikingly, it's during this first age of globalization that you get the beginnings of the welfare state. In Europe, you get unemployment insurance, sickness insurance, old age pensions, and so on. If any of you have Irish ancestors, I would encourage you to look at the censuses which are online in 1901 and 1911, and you'll find that on average your ancestors aged by more than 10 years between those two census dates, and that's because the old age pension came in 1908 and everybody suddenly realized that they were older than they had always thought they were. But of course this can play a useful role, as we know, in making people feel okay about the market. And what's striking is that in countries that were more exposed to globalization, countries that were smaller and more open, Belgium, the Scandinavian countries, that's precisely where these social protections were introduced the most. There wasn't a race to the bottom at this point. If anything, there was a race to the top. I always like to bring up the example of the 1904 treaty between France and Italy. There was a very modern dilemma. Italians were going to France and were benefiting from French insurance policies, and the French didn't like this. And so they did a deal, and the deal was the Italians can continue to come to France on condition that the Italians bring in the same social protections as we have in France. A very sensible solution to a problem. You can have a levelling up rather than a levelling down if that's what the politicians want. The interwar period, oh yes, and by the way, this is, since we have Danny in the audience, he found something similar using, I think, 1980s data. As of the 1980s, it was also the case that more open countries had bigger governments, and this can be seen in and interpreted in a political light. You have more openness, and so you have more demand for social insurance, and that's what the governments provide. Interwar period, that's not got to do with a long drawn-out shift in comparative advantage. It's a sudden, sharp financial shock driven largely by catastrophic macroeconomic policy linked to the gold standard. The red lines are interest rates during our recent economic crisis. They did all fall eventually, even in the Eurozone. The other lines are what happened to interest rates during the Great Depression, and as you can see, they didn't fall by very much. This is what happened to government budget deficits during this period. This is a government budget deficits in a sample of countries as a share of GDP. The red lines are the 3% criteria. God knows why I would care about 3% of GDP budget deficits, but in Europe we care about this. And the good news is that during the Great Depression, everybody hit their Maastricht targets. They all hit their 3% budget deficit targets. But of course, that was absolutely catastrophic news, because if you're in the middle of the Great Depression, your tax revenues are collapsing. You need to spend more money. If you want to hit a target like this, you're going to have to tighten like mad. And that helped exacerbate the crisis everywhere. What was to be done? What was to be done was to leave the gold standard. This is one of the most famous pictures in economic history. It shows you what happened to industrial production in a series of countries, and what you can see is that they recover at different times. So the British leave the gold standard in 1931. They start to recover. The Germans and the Americans, with their shiny new leaders, rather different, leave the gold standard in 1933 and start to recover. The French, who thought about macroeconomics in a sort of Teutonic way back then, only left the gold standard in 1936, and that's when they started to recover. And it was in the countries that stuck to gold the longest and thus suffered the sharpest Great Depressions that the switch to protection was the highest. This is just a picture taken from work by Barry Eichengreen and Doug Irwin. It shows that quotas were much more resorted to in the gold standard countries than in countries like Britain that moved to more rational macroeconomic policies earlier on. You know, get the macroeconomics right and all sorts of really bad things can happen. And of course, quotas weren't the worst of it. There were even worse political consequences in countries like Germany. So what was to be done? Improve your macroeconomic policy, but more generally, what was to be done was to bring the state in to provide the security that during this particular decade, capitalism on its own was not providing to people. This is the cover of a wonderful book by Sherry Berman, and the cover tells the story that she tells in the book, or it's one of the main messages of the book. So here are two very similar election posters. In Germany, they want Arbeit und Brot, and in Sweden, they want, what do they want? They want Arbeit, same word, and an Ölköpkraft, or however they pronounce it up there in Sweden. So they want higher purchasing power. In other words, they want bread, yes? So one of the many tragedies in Weimar Germany is that it wasn't the Social Democrats that was putting this message forward, because the Social Democrats then were still Marxists. And actually they wanted capitalism to collapse. And so they certainly weren't going to rescue it. In Sweden, by contrast, the Social Democrats had already made the transition to being properly social democrats. which meant that they actually had policies to propose. And everywhere in Europe where Democrats proposed policies that safeguarded private property, that were not communist, but that involved the state doing more stuff to hate ordinary people. Those guys all did fantastically well. Democratic politicians as different as the Swedish Democrats or, say, Eamon de Valera in Ireland, they all did fabulously well during this period. And of course, the communists understood that their real enemy was social democracy, which was a fundamentally conservative political program because it was a way of saving capitalism from its own consequences and thus undermining the demand for political protectionism, whether on the right or the left. Okay. And so we know what happened then. There's a post-war construct, Keynesian macroeconomics, social democratic welfare states, and those are eroded from the 70s or 80s. Here's a quote to end with from a book that I wrote with Jeff Williamson in 1999. And it's saying, be careful of it because globalization has undermined itself in the late 19th century. It could happen again. The point I want to make is that we were not prophetic. Danny had already written a book 2 years previously saying, watch out, folks. But even more importantly, in the 1990s, there was already a huge debate about whether rising wage inequality in rich countries was due to trade or technology. They had exactly the same debate then that we have now. And that was understandable because it was already 20 years since median wages had stopped rising in the United States. They stopped rising sometime between Saturday Night Fever and the Sex Pistols' first LP. I mean, it was a long, long time ago. This was a crisis that was a long time coming. We'd already had Ross Perot, we'd already had Pat Buchanan, After this book, we already had, 2005, the French referendum. It ended up being a referendum about markets and globalization, and we know what the consequences were. And the same class divides happened as happened in Brexit and happened with Trump. Finally, let me go back to this important point that was made in the opening talk about political leadership, because it isn't just structure that matters, agency matters as well. We have choices. And let me make a comparison between Britain and Ireland. We have, in Ireland, actually more Eastern Europeans per capita than the Brits. But we don't have the same media, number one. And number two, we have an extremist nationalist party, Sinn Féin. They're not choir boys, right? They were justifying murder up to the early 1990s. I mean, if anybody should have taken on an anti-immigrant stance, it should have been Sinn Féin. But for whatever reason, they chose not to do that. Maybe it was principle, maybe it was cynical positioning, but whatever the reason, that's what they did. And therefore, even though there was a latent tension concerning these rapid immigrant inflows that was manifested, for example, in the first referendum on the first Lisbon Treaty, that tension had no political outlet to go to. And the result is that we have a politics that absolutely is not anti-immigrant now. It's a much healthier politics than in Britain. So we always have choices, and especially politicians have choices. Finally, Europe. What's Europe about? Why do we have Europe? It was always about reconciling the state and the market. It was about having trade at a continental level, but not having races to the bottom. That's the whole point. That's why we have this incredibly complicated superstructure. The French were arguing for this from day one. And if you think about the China shock and you think about the need to have enough market to maintain a political support for openness, I mean, this is surely Europe's moment, although perhaps it would be helpful if it was a small country person rather than the French president who was saying so, because that would maybe be easier to sell around the continent. That's all.
Yes, so thank you very much to all our panelists for these, I thought, very interesting and very insightful contributions. So let me just kickstart the discussion with a few questions. So Kevin, maybe since you were just talking, you were talking a lot about the interwar period and how deglobalization really reached some quite extreme levels back then. And of course, this makes us worry a little bit about what might lie in our future today. But then, of course, a big difference between the situation today and the interwar period is now we have a multilateral trading system. We have the World Trade Organization. So how important do you think that's going to be? How reliable is that as a defense against deglobalization?
I mean, I think whatever the reason, I think that it's impressive how little deglobalization we've had yet, although obviously we're all worried about what might happen now, because we've had this decades-long shift in comparative advantage and a huge financial shock superimposed upon it and terrible scandals involving bankers and so forth. And yet we haven't had that much deglobalization. And surely international trading organizations have a lot to do with that. Yes, we're not moving forward and signing new trade agreements, but these international trading organizations help lock in existing levels of openness. But I wouldn't just stress the WTO and so on. I would also talk about maybe the 2009 meeting in London where they agreed on a more rational macroeconomic response to the Great Recession than they had in the 1930s. I think that surely mattered a lot. And things were going actually quite well until everybody in Europe suddenly worried that they were Greek and the policy went into sharp reverse. And that's exactly when our recovery stopped, and that's exactly when tensions in the Eurozone started to rise. I mean, there's another point here that I maybe would like to make, which is that if you look at Article 1 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and what is it? And it's basically the most favoured nation clause. It's the anti-discrimination clause. And I think there's a solid historical reason why it was there. I don't know, but I'm guessing. And it's because, I mean, what's the biggest danger if you have deglobalization? Well, in the 1930s, everybody understood that the biggest danger was that countries that needed to import food and raw materials in an environment where there were already political tensions and where deglobalization was happening felt strategically vulnerable, and that empowered nationalists there to go out and get stuff not by trade, which is one classic way of getting stuff from foreigners, but by conquest. You know, and that's partly what's going on in Japan. It's partly what's going on in Germany, if people read Adam Tooze's wonderful book on the subject. So the discriminatory nature of trade policy in the 30s was hugely dangerous. And there are obvious parallels that could be made today with China. They are undergoing rapid structural change. They're very dependent on imports. 60% of their oil comes through the Straits of Malacca. We all need to make sure that everybody feels comfortable that they can buy and sell what they need in international markets. And I think that's ultimately the function of the rule of law regarding trade. Its benefits are not actually mostly economic. I think they're geopolitical.
Great. State Secretary Ineichen-Fleisch, maybe also a question for you. I mean, this is just my observation, but when I look at anti-globalization protests in Europe, often I get the sense that people are not so much opposed to the idea of free trade as such, but to specific clauses in modern trade agreements. So think about investor-state dispute settlement issues, think about, you know, intellectual property rights, think about, you know, consumer protection and so on. So sometimes I worry that you know, we kind of mislabel these protests as being anti-trade protests, whereas they're really protests against some features of these trade agreements. So I would just be curious to get your view on that.
Yes, I think you can say that. And you see also that these, I mean, there have been all in the last 20, 30, 40s, there have always been waves of anti-globalization, but it was always different. The last one was when we were in Seattle, and that was anti-globalization, but that was anti-privatization. There was the GATS agreement, the services agreement, and there people said, we don't want to continue, you must not privatize education and health and so on. Now that was not done. People have seen that we haven't done it, the countries haven't done it. So now comes the next step, and because these agreements become more and more, they cover more and more issues. That is true. It's usually trade before was tariffs. Then it started to get into services, intellectual property, etc. And now people probably think that, you know, trade or trade policies or trade regulation gets into so many fields that somehow, do you still have control of all of this? I mean, do you have the control of the big multinationals that go and then make dispute settlement procedures in investment? What about intellectual property? I mean, do you still get the medicine for the poor in spite of, you know, and all these issues, I think, have become, first of all, very complicated to understand. That's the first issue. And secondly, it's quite easy to say, you know, this is dangerous, be careful, so we have to do something against it. Probably easier than it was when you just have tariffs. You know, that was quite straightforward.
Thank you. David, maybe also a question for you. You know, when you talk about the China shock, the China syndrome, you know, import competition from China, however you want to call it, you know, typically, you know, the media, we think about the effects this has on, you know, labor markets in developed countries, the US in particular, but also you mentioned studies in Germany and so on. which is of course interesting and also important. But sometimes I think we also forget that this China shock really lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty, and also has given hope to many developing countries around the world. So I was just wondering, if we think that it led to free trade being an idea in decline in rich countries, do you think free trade is actually an idea on the rise in countries like China because of it?
Well, it's very clear when you already look at these survey data that in the poorer countries, support for trade is very high in many countries. In China is way above 90%. In China also, a big majority of people say that trade has created jobs, has lifted up wages. So overall, people there do realize, of course, that this has been enormously helpful, and I think also other countries are now looking to China as a possible model of growth. The key point, of course, is that, as I said, we do still think that trade creates an overall increase in welfare, but we now realize more that the distributional issues are not a second-order thing that we can just shift to the side. And of course, when it comes to distribution between countries, then we have to realize that the Chinese are not participating officially, at least in the US election, right? So, so as a consequence, right, if you tell the US electorate, well, trade has been good for other countries, then this will probably not influence their own electoral decision making.
Great. So I would say, I have many more questions, but I'm sure you also have questions. So why don't we open up the discussion to the floor? So just raise your hand. There's a question back there. Just check the time.
Yes, I'm a bit obsessed by the economies of Sub-Saharan Africa. And if you travel in Sub-Saharan Africa, free trade boils down to the notion that we take their resources and they survive on our garbage. Yeah, that's really the case. And the second point is that the recent Paradise Papers might have reinforced the idea that bad politics in resource-rich countries might be reinforced by companies. Yeah, I do not know. Professor Balcerovic might say that's the Hollywood point of view, but I'm not sure. So that's essentially, there are real losers, and you cannot only say that's bad luck. You are born in a country with bad politics, and our countries are unfortunately of limited capacity.
Does anyone want to? So I guess one question you're asking is whether trade has a kind of exploiting nature. Okay.
If the question is whether trade is related to, well, it's partly, your question was whether it's exploitative necessarily, and I guess it isn't necessarily exploitative, and if the sub-Saharan Africans could benefit from being able to export to relatively open Western markets the way the East Asians have done, that would be pretty good for everybody, ourselves included. It would suit us all. And I guess there are some examples now. There's a bit of growth in Ethiopia, isn't it, and so on. So on the one hand, there's some industrialization, some parts of the continent, and on other parts of the continent, it's still resource-based. And so that I would be more keen on the first sort of trade myself. Yeah.
So we have a question back there, and then.
Well, thanks again. I can even actually follow up and maybe bring it more down to the point. We've now been talking a lot about the obvious losers of globalization of trade. We have not yet focused on how inequality comes about among the winners in the trade game. That has a lot to do with the ownership of being able to handle goods and being the ownership of companies. Having said that, in order to protect globalization, isn't it necessary to comfort the losers? And if so, wouldn't it be a means to actually close tax havens and use the money we could get then from the winners of globalization to comfort the losers?
Anyone?
Well, Kevin pointed out that the reaction to a first big wave of globalization was to introduce social security systems that provide such a cushioning. And it is the case in most Western countries that those systems, in the way they're set up, are progressive. That the high incomes pay for a disproportionate share of that money that gets redistributed. It is, of course, critical for every country to make sure that its tax policy actually works in the way it is intended to, and that means that one wants to avoid an undesired erosion of the tax base. But specifically on trade, it also bears mentioning that the United States, for instance, has a specific welfare program called Trade Adjustment Assistance that supports losers from trade. So they get extended unemployment benefits while they are retraining. They get subsidies if they're willing to accept a job that offers a lower wage than their previous employment. They get subsidies for moving to other locations if they have a new job there. And that, in principle, is exactly the type of adjustment support that one would like to offer. It is unfortunately the case that many programs that seek to help unemployed people to reintegrate into the labor market have somewhat mixed history of success. It just turns out in practice that we don't really have, it's not just that easy to just pull out a great policy to help those people. Once you have large-scale layoffs, especially of somewhat older workers, then very often it's hard to adjust. So that is certainly also an insight of the more recent research, that even a US labor market, which was considered to be very flexible, is actually not adjusting as flexibly as people hoped.
Kevin also wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think where I come down on this is that the dimension of trade that is best for poor countries is the ability to export their goods to our markets, yes? And that then creates political stress in our markets. And for the thing to work politically, we need states that are protective where they need to protect. And for that, as you said, sir, they need revenues. So trade is what really matters. And Danny's work showed that actually historically up through the early 90s or something, it was certainly the case that openness and big governments could go hand in hand. And by the way, they still go hand in hand in Scandinavia and other places, but you do need revenue for that. And surely capital mobility can help to undermine governments' ability to tax fairly. And I think that in general, the benefits of capital mobility have been oversold. It's supposed to diversify away risk. I don't think it's always done that. I think it's often led to risk being concentrated. It's supposed to flow from rich to poor countries to boost development there, whereas actually it seems to be going from China to America to sustain consumption largely, which isn't as useful. But look at Apple right now. I mean, under pressure, my country closed the loophole in 2014. Because of American pressure, essentially. And almost the next day, they moved their operations to Jersey. So, I mean, how are you supposed to deal with that? I mean, I don't think you can deal with it at the level of individual countries, but we need to. So you have two options. Either you deal with it all together, but then it has to be all together. The Irish probably would say it has to be the OECD, which isn't stupid, so long as it isn't an excuse to do nothing. It's not stupid, But I mean, there is another option, which is to limit the ability of people to shift around profits in the first place.
So Joachim?
Yeah, Joachim Ford from the UBS Center and the University of Zurich. So, Kevin, you emphasized the effect of shocks, especially in the 1930s, and how much globalization can go into reverse. But I want to sort of step back and think for a second what the historical record tells us about how good globalization is for development, especially in its early stages. And I seem to remember the work of an economic historian by the name of Kevin O'Rourke, who, for the 19th century, claimed that many of the countries that did industrialize very fast actually had a lot of protectionism, especially the United States, but also countries that did very well in the 19th century, like Argentina, like Canada, like New Zealand, and so on. So how sure are we that by pushing for free trade is best, we're not kicking away the ladder on which many rich countries actually climbed up 150 years ago?
Thanks. Yeah, so I have papers that show that there's clearly a positive correlation in the data between protectionism and growth in a sample of rich countries in the late 19th century. And it's not a carefully identified causal thing, but in the 1990s we would have said it was causal probably. and what we find is that in particular manufacturing tariffs are positively correlated with growth. And I think you can make a causal statement there, and I think I'd make it in the same way that Danny made arguments in the context of Korea and Taiwan and so on. So that's a particular phase of capitalism where there are potentially complementarities. So if you want, heavy industry of one sort, you need heavy industry of the other sort, and so on. And so you need to build up across a broad front, and the market doesn't necessarily do that for you on its own. And so there's a role for government to promote industrialization. But saying that that was true for that group of countries at that point in time doesn't mean that it was true for other countries at that point in time. I very much doubt that a counterfactually independent Ghana in 1870 would have benefited by putting on heavy industrial tariffs, for example. And saying that that is true for that particular group of countries at that point in time doesn't mean that it's true for the same countries today, because the environment has changed. One of the arguments that I find most interesting, I don't know if it's right or not, but I find it very interesting, is this argument that Richard Baldwin makes, where he argues that what's different nowadays compared to the world as late as the 1960s is that outsourcing has meant that now if you're Vietnam, you can slot yourself into some multinational's supply chain and you can start to industrialize just by producing a little widget that's selling into a broader market. So you don't need these national development strategies anymore. They had a time, but their time is over, and we're now in a brave new world. And I think that might be right. Of course, those countries' development strategies then are very dependent on globalization being sustained, and it's slightly risky, but that's another matter. Yeah.
So I think the next question was back there.
My question maybe goes rather to Madame Ineichen-Fleisch, whether you still today see a more refined difference between anti-Europeanization and anti-globalization, because I've worked on the 1960s and 70s and on Swiss interest groups and also on British interest groups, and in the historical records there's a very clear difference between anti-globalization and anti-Europeanization. So there are interest groups that are very pro-globalization and interest groups that are against Switzerland joining the against Switzerland joining the common market. So what I teach my students is to actually always look for a difference between globalization and anti-European sentiments, but seeing the common market rather as a closed space and as a restriction to trade rather than putting globalization and Europeanization on calling it the same thing. It's not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's very different. I think you have people who are anti-Europeanization or whatever you want to call it, but open to trade worldwide, to global trade. And you see it also politically in Switzerland is not at all the same issue. It's different people, it's different arguments. I mean, against the EU is mainly, foreign judges and being too much pushed into something which we actually would not like to have, or being dependent on people deciding somewhere and not ourselves deciding, whereas globalization is not so much that. It's not about decision taking, and it's not about foreign judges. It's more about really what happens with people in Switzerland, and does it have an effect on whatever, as I mentioned before, on on workers, or on different layers, or on the issue of multinationals, whatever it might be. I mean, but it's not the same discussion, and I think you have to treat it also differently and give different answers. You see, the main political party against the EU is not at all against free trade agreements, not at all. By the way, I don't like so much this word free trade, because it seems to say that you have trade without any rules, and this is not true at all. I mean, free trade means without tariffs, basically. But it doesn't mean that you can't keep your standards. It doesn't mean that you don't have, specific rules and procedures. So the word free trade is a little bit misleading, I think, or has been put into a misleading context. It's very clear what it is, and it's also very clear what it is not.
So we had two questions actually from the front here.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rolf Weder from the University of Basel. I think I want to go back to the chair's argument about whether there is a difference between the regional agreements and the criticism we observe now. Sometimes I think we're on the wrong track, because the criticism is not against the World Trade Organization. So it's typically against the regional agreements that are exclusive in the sense they discriminate against some countries. And secondly, as you mentioned, Ralph, they have include a lot of regulations that basically reduce the freedom of countries how to produce goods, how to do environmental standards and all that. So my question is, if you think about Brexit, if you think about the criticism, is it not much more against a kind of common regulation attempt than against globalization per se, as we discussed it, trade and so on?
Well, I think the one of the reasons probably that the WTO is not anymore at the forefront, as it was in the late 90s, Seattle, etc., is that not much happens there, unfortunately. So, you don't have anything to fight against. I mean, we have a lot of discussions, but if you follow the work lately, to me, it's a pity, but is a lot of discussions, but we don't expect any meaningful results in the next, for instance, the next ministerial. And I think there is something to the point that there is regulation on issues which used to be regulated nationally before and are now internationally regulated, for instance, in regional trade agreements. Services is really the main area. Services, you cannot change your banking regulation as you want if you are part of a common market, or even if you enter a free trade agreement and give some concessions to your partner, you can't change your regulation afterwards. Where before it was tariffs, tariffs, that's, you go down with the tariffs, but you don't change your internal regulation. And I think the fact that more and more you give this regulating authority or capacity to some international body or to some, that is fearsome for some, especially if you don't understand exactly how this goes. I think there is something to it.
I think Professor O'Rourke's diagram was very interesting. We'll show the difference with today and the 1930s. As I have also been studying the third economy of 1930s, especially what happened in Germany. And we can see today that many of the ideas from Germany in the 30s are being recycled as new in international bureaucracies. For example, the idea of zero interest rate or negative interest rates, it goes back to Feder and Giselle. And we can also see that some of the big bureaucracies like OECD, IMF, EU, they want to have a tax cartel, very hard tax control of all citizens. And Germany in 1938 had the best, highest tax system in the world and the best tax control. And now they try to impose this on all of Europe, and then we will have a kind of tax cartel. And that will lead to higher and higher taxes with no resistance. Well, and I'm happy that the organizers also asked Mr. Grover Nordstrom to come here tonight, as we need to have some, we can say, opposition to this moment. Because it's obvious what Kenneth Rogoff says that in his book, that he is recycling most of the old ideas from the Third Reich. That is my opinion.
Well, if you're going to make links between the 30s and international economic bureaucrats today, I actually think there's a more straightforward way of doing it, which is to go from the League of Nations, which had an economic function in the interwar period. And lots of Swedes, Per Jakobsen and so on, were involved with this at the time. And rather similar to today, they gained enormously in prestige by engaging in Troika-style programs in countries suffering from hyperinflation in Germany, Austria, Hungary, and so on. It's very good for them. And then a lot of these guys pop up after World War II and are involved in the nascent economic organizations of the time. So I think that's the way that I would draw it. And then I would also talk about the lessons that we learned from the interwar period, which is that too much market and no protective state, and above all, flawed macro policies are a very dangerous mix.
So we had a few questions actually at the very back. Please.
Yes. I got a question about, in the light of winners and losers and globalization, how would you stop the race to the bottom when big companies start to threaten states about changing their tax residence?
That's a political question.
Yes.
Does anyone want to take the question?
And we're not even in France. You get that all the time, in France, but yeah.
So how do you stop the race to the bottom, I guess, in tax competition?
Specifically individuals or companies as well?
Both, please.
Both. Yeah. Well, okay, I'm gonna wear a slightly Irish hat, although I think my government has sinned on many occasions in the past on this. But I mean, what I would say if I was talking to, the Swiss are probably just like us actually, but if I was talking to a French audience, I think what I would say is that they should distinguish between common European taxes that can finance a European treasury on the one hand, that might actually be a useful thing in the context of the Eurozone, So a common European corporate tax would help make the Eurozone function better, and that's in everybody's best interests, including Ireland's. And I think you could maybe get buy-in for that. And then what I would say to the French in response is, America has this, they have a federal corporate tax, but they let individual states set their own state tax rates. So I think there are maybe ways of finessing this politically. And I think the other thing I might say to a French audience is that the VAT system, the TVA system, is completely dysfunctional in Europe, and it leads to losses of 50, 100 billion euros a year, something like that, as a result of what is really organized criminality, fraudulent exports and this type of thing. So that has to be changed anyway. And could we not think of a way of folding e-commerce into that as part of a general tax reform? Again, I think that would be a clever way of trying to get around the opposition of the Irish and the Luxembourgers and others.
So we had another question also at the very end. Yeah, you please, the lady in the green sweater.
I was going to ask something about your slide about the gold standard. You showed us that they had this target of 3% of the debt.
Well, they didn't have a target, but it looked as if they did.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought it was.
They had a target in their heads.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they were just very conservative people.
Okay. So my question is about money, because we haven't talked about this too much, I think. And I wanted to ask if what your thoughts are on the increasing debt we have right now. I mean, especially if you look at Japan. How healthy do you perceive this development of the extremely increasing debt overall, governmental debt, and where do you see maybe the, let's say, the function the gold standard had as opposed to fiat money that we have right now? Thank you.
Right, so two questions there. On debt, I wouldn't necessarily emphasize government debt today, but that's because I'm Irish. I'd emphasize private debt. I think private debt is every bit as dangerous, right? And that's what caused the bubbles in Ireland and Spain and so on. And if you wanted to be kind of more structural about it, you might make the link with the kind of distributional trends that David is talking about and talk about poor families in America who are trying to maintain their living standards by borrowing more and more, and then that leads to all sorts of financial fragility. So I think excessive debt in general can be a dangerous thing, and there's a link with income distribution. In the context of the gold standard, I think that one way that we are now reinterpreting the gold standard in the light of the current crisis because you can get learning, we can learn about today from yesterday, but sometimes we learn about yesterday from today, and that's in a way even more interesting, is that I think we're now thinking about it in a more Germanic way. So, I mean, I think if you were German, Joachim, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but probably you would always have thought about the crisis of the 30s in terms of debt and in terms of capital flows and in terms of sudden stops of capital flows, of capital flowing into Germany so that they could repay their reparations and debt happening, and then the funding stops. And so they face a sudden stop, just as the periphery of the Eurozone did, or just as Southeast Asia did in 1997, and so on. So I think I wouldn't necessarily emphasize the gold standard in that story, except insofar as the gold standard gave the international investors the reassurance that they needed, that it was safe to invest in Germany in the first place, which was, of course, wrong. Yeah.
My name is Alain Bandle. I have a question to the globalization backlash. At the opening keynote at the World Economic Forum this year, the Chinese president coined the term of inclusive globalization, which originally I thought sounded very good. But then, frankly, I didn't really understand what he meant. Have you seen that somewhere in action now?
Yes, inclusive globalization, that has become very fashionable. Means that everybody should actually get benefits of globalization down to the poorest, up to the, And of course, this sounds good. My economists tell me they don't know what it means either, so. But at least the way we understand it is more that, you can have these trade agreements, and I think President Xi was very strong in that, the multilateral system and everything. But then in the end, those losers who we have been talking about before, you have to take care of them on the national level. I mean, you can't have an agreement which takes care of losers directly. You can have an agreement which tries to, improve the level playing field for everybody, but in the end, on a national level, you have to find the right recipe for you in order to make sure that these losers are not, that the losers don't become, the perceived losers don't become losers. And that's the only way I can get an answer to that, because I have the same question marks as you behind this word inclusive globalization.
So while you guys are still thinking, maybe one follow-up question for me. So I think it makes a lot of sense to talk about the winners of globalization, the losers of globalization, and also it seems natural then to ask for things like trade adjustment assistance, what David was saying, or a call for inclusive globalization. But sometimes I wonder, whether it really makes sense or what the rationale is for really singling out trade. I mean, why have trade adjustment assistance and not adjustment assistance, responding to technological change, or responding to having a bad boss that made you lose your job, or something like that. So it seems to me sometimes that, many things create winners and losers. Trade is one of them, but trade often gets singled out in the political discussion. So I don't know if you have any reactions to that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, of course, we have also state adjustment help to these other shocks, right? A lot of our welfare system, social security system is not specific to the source of some shock. In that sense, I actually see those trade adjustment programs also more as a, political, a sign of political will, right? To make sure to show people that one is doing something specifically about that issue. So those programs usually were started coinciding with some trade opening, right? To say, look here, we do something for the losers. Now that being said, of course, one reason why that is partly in focus is, I think, on the one hand, has an empirical side. Speaking about the United States, it's certainly clear that the labor market impacts of trade have been especially concentrated. It's sort of quite visible to people that in some locations, firms shut down entirely because of trade competition, and negative consequences are sort of enormously concentrated in clearly identifiable groups. But then also on top, of course, there is in principle some political decision making that could be influenced, right? Which is different from Another example that you gave, someone losing a job because of a bad boss. There is not much that government can do about your bad boss, but in principle, people have the sense that when they hear trade agreements being discussed, then of course there is a connection that they think here is government policy that might somehow relate to things that affect us.
Just one thought occurs to me. I mean, the most obvious example of a technologically driven shock that had labour market effects was the Industrial Revolution, which mechanised out of work, you know, a whole generation of weavers. First the spinners, who were the women, and then the weavers, who were the men. And actually, those guys were impoverished for the rest of their lives. You know, and I guess that would not be politically sustainable today. So, yeah, I agree with your general thrust to your question.
So I saw a few questions. Yeah, how about you first?
And I would like to ask you, what is the role of the big international companies? Because I believe the two previous questions, which we're hoping to get maybe and touch this subject, which, from my perspective, very often is not very. We hear that this is very political. We don't speak about what is the role of big companies, and actually, I also believe that this. Anti-globalization movements, it's mostly not about being against to trade, but against power position of big international companies. And then also these two questions, which were actually about tax avoidance and paradise papers. These are topics which are very important, maybe to voters who see that they have no power in the system which we created. And again, this very important question for people is not very discussed during panels like this one.
I would actually suggest that maybe we take another question, because we only have 3 more minutes. So maybe take one last question, and then you can maybe respond to both.
My question was regarding all these robotics and other stuff which is coming up, which is actually going to create even more inequalities, more unemployment, and we're talking about things like universal basic income, etc. How do you see that playing out, and how do you think that will be managed in the future when inequalities even grow further? And many poor countries, again, who will be the losers in the end, might be. They will not be able to pay those UBIs kind of schemes.
So maybe some quick reactions. We still have a couple of minutes.
Well, the questions obviously cover a lot of space. On technology, it's clear that there is an ongoing process of automation, which also requires shift in the work structure. There is some evidence suggesting that shift actually is not as rapid as the media often seeks to make out. So a lot of that can actually be absorbed by sort of younger generations taking up different occupations than the older generations that retire. As a consequence, we see less of those very concentrated negative impacts. If technological change would speed up a lot, right, then of course we could be back to the replacement of spinners and weavers in the Industrial Revolution, which would then create problems which are very similar to some of the problems that we saw related to trade. On big companies, I think big companies have the feature that they're just sort of more visible, right? Also, when we think about globalization, we think automatically about globalized companies. Tend to forget that, for instance, here in Switzerland, we actually have many relatively small, highly specialized companies that are just sort of the world leader in producing a specific type of screw or something. And in that sense, it's certainly the case that globalization is not just a feature of large firms. What the large firms have, by feature of being large, is of course that they might have more access to behavior that can block the operation of markets, which is then of course why we have also authorities that seek to make sure that companies adhere to correct market economy practices.
Let me say, firstly, on your question, I mean, I think it is coming on the agenda. I mean, Macron, it's a first order important issue for Macron, I think, because his electorate is really angry about this stuff. So I think we are going to be talking more about Paradise Papers and that kind of thing in Europe. More generally, in terms of policies and so on, you mentioned universal income, but for me, I mean, the striking thing about your work is that it's so regionally concentrated, you know, and so there's a regional dimension to all of these problems. And therefore, my dad was a diplomat in Brussels in the 70s and 80s, and he reported that all the time they were discussing regional policy, that they talked an awful lot back then about regional policy. And, you know, there's still a need for it today. So what I need to get my head around, and maybe some of the people here can help me, is how we can reconcile meaningful regional policy that helps prop up communities that people care about. And that's a blind spot, you know, of economists. We don't often think about the fact people actually are genuinely attached to their communities. They're human beings who live in communities. How we can reconcile a regional policy that gives people real work in their regions with our state aid rules. And I think that's a real problem. I don't have any solution for it.
Great. So in the program it says we have until 12:45 a.m., but I think that's a typo. So I suppose it's just 12:45 p.m. So well, thank you very much, panelists, for this. I thought very interesting, very insightful session. I certainly learned a lot. Thank you for coming.